Ukrainians are growing increasingly worried about the support of their one-time greatest ally, the United States. In recent days, President Donald Trump has falsely claimed that Ukraine started the war with Russia and called President Volodymyr Zelenskyy a dictator. Zelenskyy met today with Trump's special envoy to Ukraine. Keith Kellogg is in Kyiv for a three-day visit, but a planned news conference afterwards was abruptly canceled. The trip comes as Trump pressures Ukraine to accept a peace deal with Russia. The CBC's Richard Madan joins us now from Washington. So, Richard, what are we hearing from the Trump administration today?
Yeah, hey, David, we're seeing more signals that the White House is embracing those Kremlin talking points by pushing those false accusations that Ukraine is responsible for the Russian invasion and undermining the credibility of its president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Now, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz was expressing his frustration with Zelenskyy, demanding he agree to give up Ukraine's critical minerals to the U.S. as part of a peace deal that's currently being negotiated between the U.S. and Russia, with Ukraine and Europe excluded. Now, Ukraine has huge deposits of lithium, titanium, and natural gas, likely worth billions, and President Trump has linked that value to the amount of aid the U.S. has provided. Now, Zelenskyy has rejected those demands and has expressed his own frustration that Ukraine is at the table in these peace talks is not at the table in those peace talks on the future of his own country. Take a listen to Mike Waltz.
Some of the rhetoric coming out of Kyiv, frankly, and insults to President Trump were unacceptable. Look, President Trump is obviously very frustrated right now with President Zelenskyy. The fact that that he hasn't come to the table, that he hasn't been willing to take this opportunity that we have offered. I think he eventually will get to that point, and I hope so very quickly.
Now, those comments likely set the tone of Zelensky's separate meeting with U.S. envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, that you mentioned earlier. And so we don't really know what came from that since their joint press conference, as we noted, was abruptly scrapped. But there's an old saying in wartime talks, if you're not at the table, you're on it. And Ukraine continues to be concerned at the prospect of being frozen out from those continuing Russia-U.S. negotiations.
No, and there's a lot of anxiety in Ukraine, a lot of anxiety in Europe. And on that, there's going to be a lot of significant meetings happening in Washington next week.
Yeah, absolutely. Two separate trips by key European allies are taking place next week at the White House. French President Emmanuel Macron on Monday, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on Thursday. And both those leaders will likely be treading quite a delicate diplomatic line on just how to deal with an administration that's quickly shredded decades of shared foreign policy goals that's put the U.S. at odds with its traditional Western allies. Now, one key issue I expect they'll be facing is Trump's criticism that NATO members are not meeting their 2% defense spending commitment. So perhaps we'll see some movement on that. These leaders know Trump is a transactional president, so raising defense spending could be part of a broader deal linked to Ukraine's security. But the bigger concern, especially from the European perspective, is that Trump appears to be bringing Russia President Vladimir Putin in from global isolation and showing no sympathy to Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Now, David, I just wanted to flag something separately and a bit closer to home from the White House today, because we know a pretty big game is on tonight. The U.S. plays Canada in the final game of the Four Nations tournament. Now, President Trump injected some divisive politics in this high-stake matchup, cheering on the U.S. and trolling Canada on his social media account. And his press secretary took yet another dig from the White House podium. Listen.
I think he's watching for the United States to win tonight. I know he talked to the USA hockey team this morning. He talked to the players after their morning practice around 10 o'clock. And I also spoke to some folks from that team after. They were jubilant over President Trump's comments to the team. I believe they're going to put out a video of that call. So he looks forward to watching the game tonight, and we look forward to the United States beating our soon-to-be 51st state, Canada.
Yeah, so if you're on Team Canada, this has got to be a motivator. And for the record, Connor McDavid is a national treasure. I'll be rooting for him and these guys when the puck drops in just a few hours.
There's the American goaltending, Richard. That's going to be the concern. All right, Richard, thanks so much. CBC's Richard Madan in Washington. Okay, so Canada and France are some of the allies standing behind Ukraine as the American criticism grows. But if the U.S. continues to withdraw its support, will those allies be enough to fill the gap? Joining me now is Keir Giles. He's a Russia expert with the Chatham House Policy Institute and recently wrote a book titled Who Will Defend Europe? Keir Giles, welcome back to the show. It's good to see you, sir.
Hello again. Good evening.
Emmanuel Macron argued today that if the U.S. is weak over Russia, over Ukraine, it could embolden other nations to flout international rules and just destabilize things. Do you agree with the president of France that this is where the U.S. administration is taking things?
Absolutely, and this is not news. It's been long known to everybody that's watching the conflict in Ukraine that if Russia is allowed to achieve its aims through aggression, this will encourage other aggressors around the world. And of course, there are plenty of other countries that have larger neighbors that have territorial designs on them. So it's one of the ways in which the stated US policy is counterproductive. Abandon Ukraine and the supposed support for the Indo-Pacific for countries like Taiwan, South Korea is in itself endangered. But then that has to be put in a context of this broader program that the Trump administration seems to be pushing through with these new cuts that have been announced to the U.S. Department of Defense. It seems hard to imagine how exactly the United States will be able to project power in order to protect any allies, let alone not just in Europe, but also across Asia as well.
It's not just abandoning Ukraine, it's denigrating Ukraine, or at least the current government, calling President Zelenskyy a dictator, falsely claiming that Ukraine started the war. I mean, what kind of signal flares does it send up when the president is parroting Kremlin talking points here?
Well, as we heard from Richard Madan just a moment ago, it's not just embracing Kremlin talking points, it's actually embracing the Kremlin, because these supposed peace talks, what everybody is describing as peace talks in Riyadh, were not peace talks at all. The two sides went in with entirely different objectives. What Russia wanted was rehabilitation, was to be brought in from the cold, from isolation, to be forgiven for the aggression and for being led by an internationally wanted war criminal. And that is what the United States handed to Russia on a plate. With Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, afterwards describing looking forward to partnership with Russia. That has got to be alarming for anybody that is a neighbor of Russia and sees Russia as an aggressor now being facilitated by the United States.
It was a remarkable meeting that Emmanuel Macron pulled together of European allies and Canada, a lot of NATO and G7 countries, but without the United States, right? And there's this recognition that they're all going to have to do more. I think that recognition has been there for a while, but as the capacity exists to do more, to legitimately defend Ukraine in the time that's available and sort of satisfy the security concerns of Europe.
Well, sadly, I'm not so convinced that the recognition really has been there. If you leave aside the easternmost members of NATO, the ones closest to Russia and therefore the ones that take their defense the most seriously, you've had a panicked reaction every time the reality of defense incapacity has been thrust in European leaders' faces. And that's happened repeatedly with Trump's election, then the inauguration, then the latest wave of comments that show that the American security blanket is being pulled away from Europe. Each time there's the same scramble, there's the same fluster, because so little has been done in between. And now we have this fixation on the percentage of GDP defense spending targets. That's really a distraction from what's really required in order to protect allies against Russia. And that's the output rather than the input. It's what that spending actually buys and whether it matches up to NATO's targets for what's required to keep Russia out.
Right. So this is the thing about some of the defense spending calculations. Like Canada gets credit for its veterans' pensions. Now, that is a defense spending, but it doesn't help you mobilize to defend, NATO's eastern flank. And you're right. The Polish government, the Baltic states, they have a moral clarity about what they're facing there. So if the U.S. is going to go in this direction, what does a country like Canada do to help preserve global order and European security, for example?
Well, there's a big question mark over the supposed target of 5% spending of GDP that is notionally set by President Trump is actually meaningful at all, because after all, we now have the United States that is heading in precisely the opposite direction. But once again, massaging the figures to actually produce something that resembles a spending commitment that matches what somebody is asking for shouldn't be too hard for defense departments across NATO that are quite used to making up fictitious numbers to show that they're meeting targets. In the UK, we have the former Secretary of Defense, Ben Wallace, describing the Ministry of Defense accounting that arrives at 2% as blatant fraud. It's not so much veterans' pensions, it's counting tax bills that you're paying on certain purchases as part of your defense budget. So you can massage the figures however much you want, and you could potentially do that in order to show that you're meeting an increase, an incremental increase in defense spending, but it's still not what is militarily relevant for the challenge challenge that Europe in particular is facing now.
Yeah, the 5% of GDP for Canada is $100 billion a year. The total national budget is about $450 billion. So, you know, you're talking that's an enormous amount of the government revenue in a country with socialized medicine, for example, and would be 4 times what we spend now. I don't know how realistic these things are. I also don't know how realistic Trump's demands are for Ukraine to turn over huge portions of its critical minerals. He's making that demand of President Zelenskyy. He's talking about Canada being the 51st state. He's talking about pulling troops out of the Baltics, out of Germany, out of Europe. I mean, what is your sense of how you can even try to deal with this as a trade-dependent neighbor like Canada is, and as a war-torn, under siege country like Ukraine is?
Well, that's absolutely right. And the common pattern to all of this, the common element across the whole of the Euro-Atlantic community, what is left of it, is the recognition that is slowly dawning that the United States is not there as the linchpin, as the foundation of that community, but actually its common biggest threat. And that one way or another, countries across that area are going to have to deal with their own problems without US support and with active US opposition. And that is inevitably going to mean some radical readjustments, whether it is because of trade, whether it's because of defense, whether it is because of the removal of all of the underpinning of economic relationships, for example, with Europe, that may be now being scaled back as a result of economic changes within the United States. And that's even before you're faced with the kind of extortion, the blackmail demands that Ukraine has been presented with, essentially mortgaging their entire economic future as a back payment for entirely fictitious amounts of aid that the United States is supposed to have supplied, with no security guarantees ahead. The problem Ukraine has is that the demands that are being presented by the United States are not significantly worse than what has been demanded by Russia. So you have a situation where any peace deal that's presented is going to be worse than fighting on.
Yeah, and so much of the security arrangement in Europe was sort of set up post-World War II, largely with U.S. direction on it, and now pulling away from that creates a host of challenges. But as a final point, Keir Giles, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says it's unreasonable for Ukraine to get all of its land back. I think a lot of people maybe believe that about Crimea, given the way that was just allowed to happen. But Luhansk, Donetsk, a lot of the eastern flank regions that have been occupied since the war, I mean, is it possible, given the posture of the United States, to have a peace deal that gives even the majority of the occupied territory back to Ukraine at this point?
Well, there are two separate issues here. First of all, there is the moral issue of whether this is actually a self-fulfilling prophecy, because those people that throttled aid to Ukraine and did not allow Ukraine the wherewithal to actually recover and liberate those occupied territories and the people living in them are now saying, look, it was never possible. But then also there is the negotiating tactic of giving everything away to Russia before you actually even start peace negotiations. Nobody thinks that it's a great idea to hand everything to Russia on a plate before you're even discussing possible outcomes to the war.
Keir Giles, always appreciate the time and the insight. That's Keir Giles with the Chatham House Policy Institute. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.